3 months ago, the Canadian government purchased 50.4 million doses of the H1N1 vaccine. And 3 weeks ago, Health Canada approved the vaccines. And 2 weeks ago, the mass vaccination program has started. And the pressure to get vaccinated is mounting. And the Canadian Health Minister keeps telling us that every Canadian who wants it can count on having access to a safe and effective H1N1 vaccine. But are the vaccines safe? Are they effective? Do we want them? Do we need them? Is the H1N1 virus really the threat that we are made to believe it is? And the most important question is if vaccines are in fact at all justified. We need to be educated. And we need to be educated way beyond of what the information we get from the media and from mainstream science. So in order to get educated, I'm going to present Dr. Hammer's work tonight and also a lot of context. So let's start at the very beginning and with the question, what are infectious diseases? Well, based on the standard medical theory, infectious diseases are caused by pathogenic, that is disease-causing microorganism. But the theory that microbes cause diseases is one of the most protected medical doctrines of modern medicine. The theory that infectious diseases are caused by pathogenic microbes was established in the 19th century by Louis Pasteur. Louis Pasteur claimed that he had made the discovery that germs as the air, as he called it, attack a host body like a human organism and cause an infectious disease. And Pasteur's theory became known as the germ theory. But Antoine Béjart, who was a contemporary of Pasteur, made a very different discovery. According to Béjart, microbes do not invade the organism, but microbes are a part of the inner milieu of our organism. So microbes live in harmony with our organism. They live in symbiosis with our organism, and they, as Béjart says, they assist the metabolic process of the body. And Béjart proposed that microbes become only pathogenic when the organism is out of balance. So in other words, when our organism or when our organism is weak or out of balance, then these usually friendly microbes turn into disease-causing agents. And then there was Claude Bernard. And Claude Bernard also disagreed with Pasteur's germ theory. These are Bernard's famous words. Le microbe ne rien, le terrain, c'est tout. So like Béjart, Claude Bernard proposed that it is the changes of the terrain, the changes of the inner milieu that causes these microbes to turn into a pathogenic form and cause an infectious disease. While in the 20th century, it was Günther Enderlein, a German bacteriologist, who detected in blood samples a tiny, small microorganism which he called protides. And he detected, or he observed, that these microorganisms morph into various sizes and shapes when the internal environment of the organism changes. And Enderlein's theory became known as pleomorphism. And what is worth noting is, or mentioning is, that as far as Enderlein is concerned, that these microorganisms, these small microorganisms, are actually necessary for rebalancing the organism. So it's basically Günther Enderlein's theory is based on Germ. But we are not finished with Pasteur, because in 1995 there was this interesting professor, Gerald Geeson. He was professor at the time at Princeton University, and Professor Geeson, he published a book, The Private Science of Louis Pasteur. And based on Pasteur's lab notes, Gerald Geeson discovered that Pasteur had in fact published fraudulent data. So he published fraudulent data, and so with his publication, Gerald Geeson revealed basically to the public and to the world that Pasteur had committed scientific fraud. And Professor Geeson, in fact, was not the first who had exposed, or did expose, Pasteur as a liar. There was also the publication already back in 1923 by Ethel Hume entitled Pasteur Exposed. In 1940, there was R.B. Pearson, and he published the book Pasteur, Plagiarist and Impostor. So in spite of the fact that it is clearly established that Pasteur's theory is wrong, conventional medicine and medical science still propagates the false theory. And with the mass production of antimicrobial drugs and of vaccines, the pharmaceutical company is making billions of dollars per year based on a scientific hoax. And all this in collaboration with the FDA, with the United Nations, with the World Health Organization, with governments all around the globe, basically, and with the media. I'd like to draw your attention now to Dr. Rike Gerd-Hamer. Dr. Hamer's research over the last 30 years offers us an entirely new understanding of the nature of infectious diseases. Dr. Hamer is the first who investigated the cause of diseases by taking, or specifically infectious diseases, by taking into account our psyche, so our emotions, but also by taking into account the brain, which Dr. Hamer identified as the mediator between the psyche and the body. Firmly tied into the science of embryology and our knowledge of the development of the human organism, Dr. Hamer made the groundbreaking discovery that microbes do not cause diseases, that microbes play instead a supportive role in the healing process of diseases, including in the healing of cancer. And Dr. Hamer formulated his findings in the fourth biological law of the new medicine. All in all, Dr. Hamer discovered 5 biological laws. And these 5 biological laws explain the cause and most of all the natural healing phases of what we commonly call diseases. So let's clarify, what are biological laws? A biological law is, for example, that every human being starts with, or the development of every human being starts with the fertilization of an egg and with the first cell division after conception. So the characteristics of a biological law is that a biological law is always valid. It has no exception, and it is reproducible in each and every person. So applied to medicine, a biological law means that it is reproducible and valid in each and every patient's case. So we're going to look now at those 5 biological laws of the new medicine of Dr. Hamer's work, and specifically tonight, of course, to understand the nature of infectious diseases. Well, the first biological law states that every disease originates from a conflict shock that catches an individual completely off guard. In German New Medicine, this conflict shock refers to an emotionally distressing event for which we are not prepared and which we could not anticipate. Well, that psychological distress causes diseases is not per se a new discovery. Holistic concepts of medicine have always acknowledged a relationship between emotional trauma and the onset of diseases. But Dr. Hammer's discoveries go far beyond a repetition of this simple truth. Within Dr. Hammer's research, this mind-body correlation is just one detail within a whole, in fact, within a complete system that constitutes a new medicine in the truest sense of the word. And this system of the new medicine consists of 3 levels. It consists of the level of the psyche, of the brain, and of the organ level. And it is particularly the brain level that offers us completely new insights into the cause of diseases. So how did Dr. Hammer make his discovery? Well, based on the premise that all bodily processes are controlled from our brain, Dr. Hammer obtained a brain scan, so a computer tomogram of all his patients. So a computer tomogram shows layers of the brain taken parallel to the base of the cranium. We have a few examples here. And Dr. Hammer compared the brain scans with his patient's medical record and with the personal history. And he paid particular attention to his patient's recent emotional trauma. And this is what he found. He found that every disease has its own area in the brain from where the disease is controlled. And that each disease, whether it is a certain type of cancer, whether it is a skin rash, muscle paralysis, arthritis, or water retention, or an infectious disease like tuberculosis, candidiasis, hepatitis, or the flu, is linked to the same area in the brain that from where the program is controlled. So in other words, Dr. Hammer found a clear correlation between certain conflicts, how these conflicts manifest themselves on the organ level as what we call a disease, and how all this is connected to the brain. And this is what happens. So when we have a conflict shock, to look here at the details, when we have a conflict shock, the conflict shock impacts in a very specific, in fact, in a predetermined area in the brain. And on the brain scan, we see this impact as a set of sharp concentric rings. And the location, so where exactly that conflict impacts in the brain, is determined by the nature of the conflict. For example, a death fright conflict, for example, triggered by a diagnosis shock, always impacts in the brainstem. It impacts in the area of the brainstem that controls our lungs. A separation conflict, on the other hand, always impacts in the area of the brain that we call the cerebrum, and to be precise, it impacts in the area of the brain that controls our skin. The conflict of not being able to escape always impacts in the so-called motor cortex, which is the area of the brain that controls our muscle movements. So such a conflict of not being able to escape can, for example, be triggered by a traumatic vaccination experience where the child or the baby feels tied down and cannot escape and cannot basically run away. What happens on the organ level? Well, the moment the conflict impacts in the brain, the moment the brain cells receive the shock, the conflict is instantly communicated to the corresponding organ. And instantly, a significant biological special program is activated in order to assist, so I repeat and emphasize, in order to assist our organism in coping with the particular conflict situation. So Dr. Hammer identified the brain as the mediator between the psyche and the body. He identified the brain as the control station from where each and every biological program is controlled and coordinated. In German New Medicine, we view the psyche, the brain, and the organ as 3 levels of one unified organism that always works in synchronicity, that always works as one unit. And we want to understand and keep in mind that it is the psyche that is the leading component of that unit. And since this conflict involves our entire organism, since it involves the brain, the psyche, the brain, and the organ level, we speak in German New Medicine of biological conflicts rather than of psychological conflicts. So not only is this conflict shock an unexpected event in German New Medicine terms, it is also a very subjective event. In other words, it is our subjective way of experiencing that particular conflict that decides or determines which area of the brain receives the shock and consequently what symptoms will result as the conflict. Well, how we experience such a conflict is, of course, a very personal event. It is conditioned by our personal perception of the event, of the conflict. It is determined by our attitude. It is determined by our vulnerability, by our expectation, by our beliefs, and, of course, also by our fears. Well, it is very important to understand the difference between a psychological conflict and a biological conflict in German New Medicine terms. So let's look at an example. Let's say, for example, a woman unexpectedly loses her child. So the loss of a child and the distress of the loss of a child does not necessarily mean that she suffers a loss conflict in biological terms. This woman can also suffer, over the loss of a child, a separation conflict which would involve her breasts that are synonymous for caring and for nurturing. She can also suffer the conflict of feeling powerless, which will involve her thyroid. Or she might have an anger conflict over what happened, and this will involve her liver. She can, of course, also suffer this conflict as a biological loss conflict, which will involve her ovaries. So whether the woman develops breast cancer, or a thyroid condition, or a liver condition, or ovarian cancer, this is determined by what she subconsciously associates with the conflict the moment that conflict occurs. So it is always our subjective feeling behind the conflict that determines what symptoms will occur as a result of the shock. And the moment the conflict occurs, the tissue-related significant biological program is instantly set into motion. So let's look at the second biological law to get closer into this. The second biological law states that every disease runs into phases provided there is a resolution to the conflict. So I'm going to explain this diagram of German New Medicine. And this is what we learn. Before we have a conflict shock, we are in a state of normotonia. Normotonia means that sympathikotonia alternates with vagotonia. So these terms relate to our autonomic nervous system, and really all it means is that during the day we are in a natural state of stress, and during the night we are in a natural state of rest. And Dr. Hammer discovered that the moment we experience such an unexpected conflict, this natural day and night rhythm is instantly interrupted, and we enter the so-called conflict active phase, which is now a prolonged state of stress. And the moment the conflict is resolved, CL stands for conflict resolution, or conflictolysis, so conflict resolution. The moment the conflict is resolved, we enter the healing phase, which is a prolonged state of rest. Well, Dr. Hammer calls this unexpected conflict shock a DHS, or Dirk-Hammer syndrome, which, of course, which is in honor of his son Dirk, whose tragic death in 1978 was the cause why Dr. Hammer himself developed cancer, and which, in fact, initiated his research. So let's look now, what are the signs and what are the symptoms of conflict activity? Well, we all have been there many times, all of us. Typically, when we are conflict active, we are totally preoccupied with the conflict. We can't think of anything else. We can't sleep, we can't eat, right? And we have very little appetite. So we have very little appetite and we can't sleep. But the extra waking hours, so by waking up at 3 o'clock in the morning and thinking about the conflict, serves already a purpose. And the purpose is to put us into a mental state and to arrive into the perfect condition to find a resolution to the conflict as quickly as possible. Or we call the conflict active phase also the cold phase, because when we are stressed out and conflict active, or in sympathikotonia, our blood vessels are constricted, and as a result, we have cold hands, we have cold extremities. So all cold symptoms, like the shivers or like the cold sweats, only occur during the conflict active phase. Well, the moment the conflict is resolved, we enter the healing phase. And the organism switches basically into vagotonia, into a prolonged state of rest. And this is why we are very tired when we are healing. Fatigue, my friends, is always an indication that a natural healing process is running its course. We call the healing phase also the warm phase, because now in the healing phase, the blood vessels are widened, and as a result, we have warm hands, we have warm extremities, and we might even have fever. So all warm symptoms, so to speak, like fever or inflammation, only occur during the healing phase. So fatigue, fever, and inflammation are, as we all know, all symptoms of an infection, and we want to keep this now in mind. So what happens now on the organ level, and how do these significant biological programs play out on the physical and on the organ level? And this, my friends, is the first time in the history of medicine that we have a system we can work with. And this is the system. If more tissue is required to facilitate a conflict resolution, then the organ responds to the related conflict with cell proliferation. So let's look at an example. And let's look, for example, at colon cancer. Our intestines are linked to, as Dr. Hammer calls it, an indigestible morsel conflict. An indigestible morsel conflict. While animals experience these conflicts in real terms when, for example, a food chunk or a bone is stuck in the intestines. And when this is the case, the intestinal cells around that food morsel immediately start to multiply and to proliferate. And the biological purpose of the cell proliferation is to produce more digestive juices so the food morsel and this food chunk can be digested and can pass. And Dr. Hammer found that we humans can also suffer these indigestible morsel conflict, but most of the time in a transposed sense. So for us, such an indigestible morsel can translate into an insult, or into an accusation, into a betrayal, into a divorce, into the loss of a workplace that we cannot digest, or we feel we cannot digest. And the moment that indigestible morsel conflict occurs, the area in the brain that controls the colon receives the shock, and the program is instantly set into motion. So during the conflict active phase, there will be cell proliferation of intestinal cells forming a colon tumor at the site where this figurative morsel is stuck. Well, as we learned, the psyche, the brain, and the organ always work as a unit. Always work as a unit. So the degree of the cell proliferation and the size of the tumor is determined by the intensity of the conflict activity during the conflict active phase. So if such a conflict is very intense, then the tumor grows very fast and becomes quite big. Conventional medicine calls such a colon cancer a malignant growth. But Dr. Hammer's research shows that diseases are not, or that cancer are not malignant diseases, but in fact meaningful biological processes that have been practiced for millions of years. While other tissues and organs that respond to the related conflict with cell proliferation are, for example, our lungs, our mouth mucosa, the liver, the pancreas, the prostate, the uterus, the kidney tubules, the breast glands, the underskin, the pleura, and the peritoneum. And Dr. Hammer found that this meaningful cell proliferation only occurs in tissues that are controlled from the so-called old brain, which is the brainstem and the cerebellum. So this information is important to understand infections, because this is, my friends, what happens during the healing phase. Well, the moment the conflict is resolved, this meaningful cell proliferation instantly stops. And during the healing phase, the cell proliferation and the tumor, so to speak, is now decomposed and broken down with the help of tubercular bacteria and of fungi that are specialized to do exactly that. In order to understand the beneficial role of microbes that Dr. Hammer formulated in the fourth biological laws, we have to understand the following. We have to understand that when our organism developed over time, microbes developed with our organism. And the task and the job of the microbes is to maintain our tissues and our organs and keep them in a healthy state. In fact, every newborn, every baby receives with the mother milk tubercular bacteria, which indicates the biological significance of TB bacteria. And Dr. Hammer found two more important things. He found, first of all, that during normotonia and during the conflict active phase, these microbes are dormant, they are inactive. But the moment the conflict is resolved, the microbes start to decompose the tumor. Dr. Hammer also found that the style and the manner in which these microbes work is in full accordance with evolutionary logic. So fungi and mycobacteria are the oldest microbes. So consequently, they populated the oldest tissue that is controlled from the oldest part of the brain. And as soon as the related conflict is resolved, these fungi and mycobacteria immediately start to remove the tumor. The fact that tubercular bacteria and fungi remove the tumor and the cancer is an indication that A, a cancer is never malignant, and secondly, that the cancer is reversible. In order to understand this even better, I will explain the following. We have to realize that the tumor that develops during the conflict active phase consists of what we could call disposable cells. And these disposable cells, they differ in size and in shape from the original cells. And this is important because since they differ in size and shape from the original cells, the mycobacteria can differentiate them from the original cells and decompose only the cancer cells. But tubercular bacteria are truly remarkable, because the moment the DHS occurs, the moment we have such a conflict shock, the tubercular bacteria start already multiplying. They start already multiplying parallel to the tumor growth. The TB bacteria, they multiply at the same rate as the tumor grows, so that when the conflict is resolved, there will be the sufficient amount of bacteria available to decompose that tumor. Well, now, of course, during the healing phase, we're going to see symptoms. For example, discharge, because the remnants of this decomposing process have to be eliminated through the stool or through the sputum, through the skin or through the urine, depending what organ is healing at the time. Another symptom that is typical that there is bacteria involved are night sweats. And depending on the intensity of the healing phase, these night sweats can be excessive. Healing always occurs in a fluid environment, so there will be swelling, and swelling can cause a lot of pain. And typically for healing, there's also inflammation and fever and fatigue, because keep in mind, our organism is doing the healing phase in a state of vagotonia and a prolonged state of rest. So we see during the healing phase typically tubercular or TB infections, like in TB infections that involve the lungs or the colon. But here we also find candidiasis. For example, candida infections in the mouth or in the colon or in the vagina. Well, what we learned from Dr. Hammer's work is now that infections are not really diseases, but that infections are healing symptoms. While the intensity of the healing symptoms is always determined by the intensity of the conflict active phase. So if a conflict active phase took very long and was very intense, the healing phases will be, healing symptoms like, for example, infection, will also be more intense. If this is the case, gentle interventions might be considered. And with gentle, we mean to slow down the microbial activity and not kill or eradicate these helpful microbes. So there is no killing or zapping of microbes in German new medicine, because if the tubercular or fungi, bacteria or fungi are not available, then the tumor stays in place and encapsulates. And such an encapsulated tumor can be found years later doing a routine checkup, and often decades later, in fact, doing a routine checkup through a lung X-ray, through a colonoscopy, a mammogram, and so forth. And this can, of course, cause new conflict shocks and new cancers. This is the fifth biological law. Every disease is part of a significant biological special program, so of a meaningful biological stance. It created to assist an individual during a biological crisis or a biological conflict, as we call it in German. Well, the Italian oncologist Dr. Simoncini received a lot of publicity for his claim that he had discovered that cancer is caused by a fungus and that he can cure cancer with sodium bicarbonate, which is more known as baking soda. So wherever I find candida, I make the diagnosis of a cancer, so he says. What is interesting is that Dr. Simoncini found the presence of candida fungi specifically in cancers of the colon and in cancers of the lungs, which are organs where fungi typically remove these cancers. So Dr. Simoncini basically confirms Dr. Hammer's discoveries. But Dr. Simoncini, he made the correct observation, but his conclusion was wrong. Because fungi do not cause the cancer, but fungi, in fact, remove the cancer. Well, as far as Dr. Simoncini's cancer treatment with baking soda is concerned, we have to realize that he administers the baking soda at a time when the cancer is already healing naturally. So when the cancer is already naturally removed by the fungi. What we also need to know is the following, and this is a little bit disturbing. There is the publication by Dr. Mark Circus, who is a follower of Dr. Simoncini. And this is a quote from Dr. Mark Circus' book. Sodium bicarbonate, so baking soda, will be given to you usually as a drip before and during your methotrexate treatment to help protect your kidneys. What most people don't realize is that methotrexate is a chemotherapeutic drug. So much for the promise or the claim that baking soda can cure cancer. So let's go back to the science and ask the question, why do fungi and tubercular bacteria remove cancers? And Dr. Hammer asked himself the same question. And he found the answer in the science of embryology. And this is a beautiful quote. The science of embryology and our knowledge of the evolution of man is the foundation of medicine. They are the two sources that reveal to us the nature of cancer and of all so-called diseases. And this is the science of embryology, which is the foundation of the 5 biological laws. And this is why Dr. Hammer calls the 3rd biological law the ontogenetic system of tumors, and the 4th biological law the ontogenetic system of microbes. Ontogenetics refers to the development of the fetus during the embryonic stages. And we're going to look at this now, and before we do this, I'm going to introduce you to the biological compass of German New Medicine that summarizes the 3rd biological law. So what we see here is the following, and we have already learned parts of it. We have seen, or we learn, that all organs and tissues that are controlled from the old brain generate during the conflict active phase cell augmentation. And after the conflict is resolved, the cell proliferation or the tumor is broken down with the help of specialized microbes like TB and fungi. The reverse principle applies to all organs and tissues that are controlled from the new brain or the so-called cerebrum. With all these tissues, we see during the conflict active phase tissue loss, meaningful tissue loss, and when the conflict is resolved, the tissue is refilled and replenished with new cells. And now let's look into the soul and to the heart of new medicine, which is embryology. This is a most fascinating part. This here is an image or picture of a blastocyst. A blastocyst is a cluster or a group of cells from which the embryo develops. on the 13th day after conception, so after the fertilization of the egg, the blastocyst divides into 3 embryonic germ layers, which is the endoderm, the mesoderm, and the ectoderm. And during the development of the fetus, the endoderm, the mesoderm, and the ectoderm develop step by step the entire organism. In fact, when the fetus develops, the fetus passes in a highly accelerated speed all the evolutionary stages from a single-celled organism to a complete human being. So let's look now at the details. While the endoderm is the first and oldest germ layer. So the endoderm develops all the organs of the alimentary canal from the mouth to the rectum, but also our lungs, the liver, the kidneys, the prostate, and the uterus. And since the endoderm is the first and oldest tissues, all these tissues are controlled from the oldest part of the brain, which is the brainstem. And during the conflict active phase, all these tissues generate cell augmentation, and during the healing phase, the tumor and the additional cells are decomposed and broken down with the help of fungi and tubercular bacteria that are specialized to do just that. While the mesoderm is divided into 2 parts. The older mesoderm develops the underskin, which is the skin under our epidermis. Then it develops the pleura, which is the skin that covers the lungs. It develops the peritoneum that covers and lines our abdominal cavity. It lines the pericardium, so our heart, and in female, the breast glands. And all these organs and tissues that derive from the old brain mesoderm, they are controlled from the cerebellum. And because the cerebellum is part of the old brain, that's why we refer to this germ layer as the old brain mesoderm. And during the healing phase, these tumors and this cell proliferation that develops during the conflict active phase is during the healing phase also decomposed and broken down and removed exclusively with fungi and tubercular bacteria, as we see, for example, in the healing of glandular breast cancer. While the new brain mesoderm develops the bones, the muscles, the cartilage, the tendons, the ligaments, our lymph vessel system, the ovaries, the testicles, and the spleen, just to give a few examples. All these new brain mesodermal tissues are controlled from the cerebral medulla. And since the cerebral medulla, that is an interior part of the cerebrum, belongs to the new brain, we see during the conflict active phase a meaningful tissue loss. And during the healing phase, this tissue loss is refilled and replenished with new cells. Well, as far as the microbial activity is concerned, it is all bacteria that are not tubercular bacteria or fungi. They assist now the reconstruction of the tissue loss that occurred during the active phase. So, for example, Staphylococcus bacteria, Streptococcus bacteria, they assist the reconstruction of the tissue that was lost in the active phase. And this is important, namely that microbes never cross the tissue threshold. And this is why we never see tubercular infections in the ovaries, for example, and we never see Staphylococcus or Streptococcus infections in the uterus, because microbes stay at the tissue that they originally populated. while the ectoderm is the youngest germ layer. So the ectoderm develops the epidermis, so our skin. The ectodermal tissue also lines our mouth mucosa. It also lines the milk ducts. It lines the bile ducts of the liver. It lines the pancreatic ducts, the bronchia, and the nasal membrane. We're going to go back to all these tissues a little bit later. And all this ectodermal tissue, which is derived from the youngest germ layer, are therefore controlled from the youngest part of the brain, which is the cerebral cortex. But Dr. Hammer first theorized that viruses must be the microbes that assist now the healing phase of a cortex-controlled tissue. But Dr. Hammer made a significant discovery. He found that all these cortex-controlled tissues, whether it's the skin or our nasal membrane or the bronchia, heal without the participation of microbes. So Dr. Hammer wondered, naturally, that maybe viruses are not even present in the human body. But based on the genetic system of microbes, he proposed that if viruses were present in the human body, then viruses would, just like TB bacteria and fungi, assist the healing process, in this case of cerebral cortex-controlled tissues. So at this point, he left it open. But the fact is, if viruses were present in the body, then the hepatitis virus, for example, would assist the healing of the liver. The herpes virus would assist the healing of the skin. And an influenza virus would assist the healing of the nasal membrane. So this, of course, opens a completely new debate about viruses and if viruses are in fact the cause of AIDS, for example, or of hepatitis, or of cervical cancer, of SARS, or of the flu, like the swine flu, right? It also challenges, I should say, the conventional understanding of epidemics and of pandemics. For example, of the Spanish flu epidemic, of the lung tuberculosis epidemic that occurred, both of them occurred at the beginning of the 20th century. It also questions the cause of the AIDS epidemic and, of course, of the purported threat of the swine flu, so to speak. So now let's look at pandemics and epidemics from a German new medicine point of view, and we're going to start with lung tuberculosis. In order to understand lung tuberculosis, we need to know more about the biological program of the lungs. So in order to understand lung tuberculosis, we have to understand the biological program that is linked to our lungs. So the conflict linked to our lungs is a death-fright conflict, because in biological terms, the death panic is equated with not being able to breathe. So the moment a death fright occurs, the lung alveoli cells that are in charge of processing oxygen immediately start to multiply and to proliferate, forming lung nodules or a lung cancer. And the biological purpose of the lung nodules and the lung cancer is to increase the capacity of the lungs so the individual is in a better position and to cope with the death fright. So we keep in mind that during the conflict active phase, such a lung cancer does not show any symptoms. But this changes during the healing phase. The moment the conflict is resolved, these lung nodules and the lung cancer is decomposed with the help of tubercular bacteria. So now we are seeing the typical symptoms, which is tubercular discharge in the sputum, potentially mixed with blood, but also painful coughing. But the coughing, of course, allows the remnants of this decomposing process, so the remnants of the tumor, to be eliminated. Typical healing symptoms are night sweats, fever, and fatigue. And this is what is called lung tuberculosis. But as we understand, the magnitude or the intensity of the healing symptoms is always determined by the intensity and the duration of the conflict active phase. So such a healing phase that takes long and is ongoing can cause serious complication, because with the coughing up of blood, with excessive night sweats and extreme fatigue, such an intense healing phase can in fact consume a person and cause death if this goes on over months and months and months. Well, needless to say that during the 4 years of the First World War, millions of people were suffering death frights. And when the war ended, basically masses of people, millions of people went into healing, which caused then the lung tuberculosis epidemic of 1918. But why did so many people die? Well, we have to understand that when tubercular bacteria decompose these tumors, they produce a lot of tubercular secretion, and so tubercular secretion is very high in protein, which is then expelled basically through the sputum. So this causes then obviously protein loss. And severe protein loss can cause severe protein deficiency, which in turn can cause death. Well, because or due to the extreme poverty after the First World War, the majority of people who had lung tuberculosis did not get the sufficient nutrients, not enough protein-rich food needed for healing and for surviving, and as a result, millions and the majority of them died. Well, in 1944, antibiotics were for the first time administered to TB bacteria. So the reason why antibiotics seem to work is that the drugs destroyed the bacteria that were necessary to remove these tumors. So the antibiotics basically prevented another lung tuberculosis epidemic, but by eradicating these helpful bacteria, the lung cancers of millions of people that suffered the death frights through another world war could not be removed and encapsulated and stayed in place. And during routine checkups, basically millions of people that had checkups, over since 1944, were then diagnosed with lung cancer. So that is the reason why lung cancer is the most frequent cancer to this day. Of course, today, lung cancers are often triggered by death frights caused by a diagnosis shock, usually and often by a cancer diagnosis shock that the person associates or experiences as a death fright. So what we're learning here is that epidemics or pandemics occur when masses of people go into healing with the same type of biological conflict. Well, I found this very interesting picture in an article on the website about the war in Georgia. And it shows how a conflict shock can, as for example a death fright, can affect our entire family. So this is a very powerful picture. And it was entitled Death Fright, Georgia-Russia War. This is how I found it. Well, after 9/11, guess what? Lung cancer increased dramatically in the New York area. Well, from the German New Medicine's perspective and from our knowledge, this was, of course, expected. But it's not, as it says here on this Google search, that this lung cancer was caused by the dust or by the debris, but that this lung cancer was in fact caused in lots of people by the death frights that masses of people experienced in the New York region and beyond. Okay. So let's look now at the Spanish flu. The Spanish flu also started at 1918, and also many millions of people died of the Spanish flu. So let's look a little bit closer. This is a really great diagram or chart, because what are we seeing? We see that the Spanish flu epidemic started during the last week of September and reached its peak at the end of October. So we, of course, have to ask ourselves why exactly during this period. And this is why. Because on September 14th, 1918, the German Emperor Karl announced the end of the war. So here's September 14, and this is exactly that shortly after, this is when the Spanish flu started. So we see clearly that this is linked to an emotional distress that people suffered. So what are the symptoms of the Spanish flu? The symptoms are fever, coughing, and pneumonia. So in order to understand pneumonia from a German new medicine point of view, we have to understand and learn now about the biological program of the bronchia. So let's slowly ease into this. Well, as we learned, if more tissue is required to facilitate a conflict resolution, the organ will respond to the conflict with cell proliferation. And as we learned, this meaningful cell proliferation only applies to organs that are controlled from the old brain. And Dr. Hammer found that the exact opposite principle occurs with all organs and tissues that are controlled from the cerebrum. So if less tissue is required to facilitate a conflict resolution, the organ will respond to this conflict with a meaningful tissue loss. And the bronchial tubes, to be precise, the lining of the bronchial tubes are controlled from the cerebrum. And that's why we see tissue loss in the active phase. But what is the conflict that is linked to these tissues? Well, the conflict linked to the lining of the bronchial tube is a territorial fear or fright conflict. Such a territorial fear relates to fears in our domain. For example, fears at the workplace, fears at home, fears in our house, but also to fears in an area where a person or where people experience extreme fear and get very, very scared. For example, in regions or in countries where there is a war. So during the conflict active phase, as I already mentioned, there will be tissue loss process in the active phase. So the biological purpose of the tissue loss is to widen the bronchial tubes so more oxygen can be taken in, which gives the individual puts the individual in a better position, right, to deal with the death fright, to get more oxygen in. Well, as soon as the conflict is resolved, this tissue loss that occurred during the conflict active phase will be refilled and replenished with new cells through cell proliferation. So as a result, during the healing phase, there will be swelling in the bronchia. So typically, this swelling causes also spasm. So there will be coughing, typically painful coughing. There can be inflammation in the bronchia, which is called bronchitis. So depending on the degree of the healing phase, these symptoms can range from light coughing to inflammation of the bronchial tubes, which is called bronchitis, to severe pneumonia. an intense healing phase that involves the bronchia can cause serious complications, which is caused by the big swelling in the bronchial tube, by the inflammation, and by the high fever. And this is why so many people died of the Spanish flu, because they went through a long years of conflict activity, of fear and of frights, and during the healing phase, of course, they experienced these really heavy symptoms. So it is the pneumonia really with the water retention in the lungs that caused the deaths of many of these people. So what we need to understand is that these complications, these serious complications, can occur with any flu, whether it's called the Spanish flu or the seasonal flu or the bird flu or the swine flu. This is a typical complication. Before we continue here, we have to ask the question, can diseases be contagious? Can diseases be contagious? According to German New Medicine, the answer is no, because microbes are only active during the healing phase. So fungi and mycobacteria remove the additional cells that are no longer needed, and bacteria, they assist the reconstruction of cells. So when 2 or more people have the same type of symptoms, this indicates that the 2 people are in the healing phase of the same type of conflict. This typically occurs when family members experience the same type of conflict shock. For example, anger conflicts or separation conflicts, abandonment conflicts, or loss conflicts. So when a whole, we have seen the picture with the people with the Georgia War, so when a whole family experience the same conflict, when they go into healing at the same time, then they will, of course, experience the same type of symptoms. Well, also, if we understand that diseases do not originate in the body, but that diseases in fact originate in the psyche, and that basically through a DHS, and it is the brain that initiates or activates a biological response to this conflict, then we also realize that diseases cannot be contagious. Also, Dr. Hammer was in fact not the first who demonstrated that diseases cannot be transmitted from person to person. There was the German physician Rudolf Virchow who demonstrated through experimentation that if live bacteria are transmitted to another person, that the other people do not develop the same disease. In fact, there were audacious researchers, including Virchow himself, who ingested whole germ cultures without developing the disease. So what does this tell us? It tells us that the hypothesis that diseases are contagious is not reproducible and therefore not scientifically substantiated. Or in simple terms, it tells us that we won't get the flu even if somebody has a good and wet sneeze at us, right?